Well, thanks for coming out today and for having me back on campus. I love to do these programs and love being up here. For those of you who struggled mightily in Econ 101, as I did, it can be quite a challenge, really, to understand what's going on with the economy. I found out, though, when I was hosting Minnesota Public Radio's midday program, that when in doubt, the surefire way to crack the econ code was to ask the experts, namely the co-chairs of the Midday Council of Economic Advisors, Chris Farrell and Louis Johnston. Chris is economics correspondent for American Public Media's Marketplace program, economics commentator for Minnesota Public Radio, and a columnist for Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. Louis, of course, is a fixture here on campus, teaches economics at St. John's and St. Ben's, and he is the McCarthy Center's new Joseph P. Farry professor, also writes a column for MinPost. Come on in, don't be shy. Co-chairs of our old Midday Council of Economic Advisors. Now, we're going to be talking, the three of us, about the state of the economy for a little while. Then we'll be opening the floor for your questions and comments, so get ready. But again, make sure that you wait until Stacy can get a microphone to you so we can get your question on the radio. Minnesota Public Radio will be broadcasting our program today, broadcasting it tomorrow at noon on the MPR News station. So those are the ground rules. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on stage. We're coming to the end of the year, and let's start with a nice small question. What is the state of the U.S. economy as we come to the end of the year? Louis, you're the home, you have the home court here. Why don't you get to start?
Home gets to bat second, I thought, but no. Thank you guys for coming up. This is wonderful to have you here on campus with us and to be guests of the McCarthy Center and of St. John's and St. Ben's. I actually think the state of the economy right now is pretty darn good, especially considering all of the headwinds, as Ben Bernanke calls them, that the economy has faced this year. Growth of 2.5% to 3%, especially over the last 6 months or so, is amazing given the fiscal cliffs and all the headwinds, as Ben said, that are facing the economy out of Washington, D.C. in terms of tax policy and spending and whether we're going to have our debt paid off and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I could easily have predicted that the economy wouldn't grow at all in the face of that. So I actually think things are looking pretty good in the aggregate.
Chris?
So what I thought was going to happen in 2013, I actually now think is going to happen in 2014. So I can revise my forecast, because what I underestimated is, how shall I put it, the craziness in Washington, D.C. Because the private sector economy has not been doing that bad. If you look over the past 12 months, private sector economy is growing at a 3% plus rate, and the overall economy is only growing at a 2% plus rate, right? And the basic reason is, as Louis was mentioning, he had this thing called the fiscal cliff and debt ceiling debates and shutting down the government, and that to a large extent this was a drag on the economy. And so the optimism is that fiscal policy is not going to be as tight, it's not going to matter as much in 2014, and the private sector economy is growing fast. And when you're looking at things, you know, it's easy to make fun of, you know, the initial public offering of Twitter and a lot of the social media, and they don't have any profits. But nevertheless, this information technology is reaching deeper into corporations, it's reaching deeper into our lives, and that's behind a lot of investment that's going on. And for the post-World War II era, when you're looking at things like software and equipment, it's at a record high. So I think this sort of unleashing of the, what John Maynard Keynes called the animal spirits of capitalism, which have been pretty constrained for the past 5 years, that we actually may have a little bit of excitement going on in the private sector economy, in Washington doing less to hold it back.
So can we officially declare the recession over? Mr.
It
Farrell?
was over a while ago. The recession, now, no one believes me. Now, the wise people, the National Bureau of Economic Research, you know, they get around and they have some cards and they play a little bridge, and they determine when you have the downturn in the economy, when you have the upturn. So, you know, the economy bottomed out in 2009. but we've had this slow growth. June of 2009, we had this slow growth economy, and the stock market bottomed out in March of 2009. And it's a slow growth economy, and the unemployment rate's 7%, but it's getting better, but it's also a lot of people have been discouraged. A lot of people have been forced to take Social Security at age 62. You lose your job, you can't get another job. You apply for Social Security. So there's a lot of why, if you just wander around the streets, a lot of people believe that this economy's not been growing. I think that if you look at some of the major factors of our economy, housing is doing better. The automobile market, it's doing better. So I do think that you are going to see sort of the more traditional signs of growth that lead to greater consumer confidence and business confidence to invest in the future.
Louis, time to break out the party hats?
Well, I think context matters a lot. I don't know about party hats, but at least have a celebration, at least that things are better. For example, one of the things that where context really matters is that since the early 80s, we've been going through what economists have come to call the Great Moderation. Growth has been fairly steady, inflation's been under control, and when we did have a recession, it was pretty mild. And so what we've experienced now is the worst since the Great Depression. And it's hard for us to realize that relative to the drop we took in 2007, 2008, we've actually done pretty well. Especially, I wouldn't trade places, for example, with Ireland or Spain or Portugal or Greece or any of those countries. They've had it way worse than we have. And I think if you look at either that cross-country context or the historical context, maybe not party hats, but I don't know, what's a slightly smaller than a party hat? A glass of champagne without a party hat or something like that?
Chris?
Okay, now can I go to on the other hand?
Oh, yeah.
So
It's 5 minutes in. We have to do the other hand.
So I do think that we're going to have improvements in the job market and have the investment and technology. One area in the economy that I don't think is going to get better anytime fast is wages. And if you think about the people and who are working, and when do you think they're going to be comfortable walking to the boss's office and say, I'm tired of being paid this amount of money. I'm tired of not getting a pay raise. Give me I'm not going to be greedy. Give me a 5% raise, or I'm going to walk. Now she's going to laugh and say goodbye. And that is the economy that we are in, and for a considerable period of time. So one reason why, people are going to feel better, their retirement savings plan is getting better, their home equity is getting better, but at a very fundamental level, they're still trying to do things like students who are on the college campus, trying to pay for college out of an income that is not growing once you adjust for inflation, or you adjust for the quality of life that many of us are trying to maintain.
Minnesota, looking at the statistics, is doing a lot better than almost any other state in the nation. 4.6% now is the unemployment rate. The new figures came out today, much lower than the national level, which have been going down. Why is it? And apparently we have one of the fastest growing economies in the nation. We have a budget surplus, a state budget surplus. We've recovered all the jobs that were lost in the Great Recession and are now adding to them. Why are we so golden? Louis?
Well, two things. I think, one, if you put them together as kind of making stuff is something that we haven't been as dependent on as other states for quite a while now. So if you look at what really got hammered in the recession, housing and construction, brutal. People just lost jobs and houses stopped being built. And then raw manufacturing, automobiles, the kind of things that you think of when you think of assembly lines and stuff like that. Minnesota is not nearly as dependent on that as other states and hasn't been for a long time. And so when the initial shock of the recession was over, the sectors that we had poised to grow in Minnesota were things like education, healthcare, medical devices, information technology, and those things have come back really smartly. And so I think that's been an advantage both over the long run, because I think that's where the U.S. and global economy are going, but also it's been good in the short run because when the initial shock of the recession wore off, the stuff that we had ready to go did really well.
Chris?
So the other thing I would add to that is Minnesota has kind of a boring economy, and that this is a fundamental strength over time because we have a very well-diversified economy. So there's no one sector like Silicon Valley that dominates whether our economy is going up or it's going down. And so we have a decent financial sector, we have a decent manufacturing sector, we have a decent farm sector. I mean, you start going through this economy, and so Minnesota's always had something of a high base that we're coming off of. And so we don't necessarily go down as much as the rest of the country when we're in troubled times, and we do benefit disproportionately on the other side. The other thing that would add to it also is we have a benefit, a historic benefit. I hope it's not a legacy benefit, but Minnesota has a well-educated population. And so a lot of businesses have invested in Minnesota reflecting that well-educated population, because I don't know if any of you have realized this, but it's cold in Minnesota. And when I moved here from New York City, this is not an exaggeration to tell the story, but every single person that I talked to in New York City, I said I was moving to Minnesota, the first thing out of their mouth was, "You know it's cold there, don't you?" So in a comparative advantage sense, the only comparative advantage that Minnesota has, or one of the main comparative advantages it has been a well-educated population. And if you think about the whole national conversation we're having about the economy and skills and where is it going to be the future growth, it is all in the educated sectors of the economy.
And just to build off that, that's where if you were going to have a yellow light or a caution about going forward that I'm worried about, because the achievement gap in Minnesota is so big right now, and the populations that are growing right now are non-white, lower income populations that tend to not have as high graduation rates. And so, as you said, I'm concerned that it's a legacy, that it's not an ongoing advantage to us. And we've got to really get our eyes on that prize and nail that down, because otherwise there are other states that are going to be able to surpass us, I think, in terms of their skills.
Quick question about education then. How much debt is too much debt to take on as a way to get a, post-secondary training, post-secondary education? How much debt is too much?
Stunning silence. Well, I mean, I was thinking of the smart aleck comment, which is enough to pay my salary and keep this place going.
It's not all
right.
about you.
It isn't? Oh, well. No, but if you think about it this way, the premium to a college education, and in fact, the premium to even just 1 or 2 years of college is substantial enough that you should ask, how much more will I make from that job compared to the debt I might take on? And unless you're going to a program where you're taking on $50,000 of debt in the first year, and your wage over the next year is only going to go up by $500, as long as you can match up the increase in your lifetime wage, what you're going to earn over the course of working, with what you're going to have to take on as debt, it makes sense. So there isn't actually a number. You have to make that comparison between those two things.
Chris, any advice?
Well, I think that you want to be really wary about taking on debt. So there's a couple of rules of thumb that are out there. And rules of thumb are reasonable starting places to then start doing some calculations. So you don't want to have, if you're going to start out with your first job at $40,000 a year, you don't want to have more than $40,000 of debt. That's a classic number. Of course, my problem with that with a lot of undergraduates is, do you really know what you're going to be earning your first couple of years? And so that's a little bit of a wary number, but again, it's a place to start. Another one is that comes from Sandy Baum and some of her cohorts in terms of studying student loan debt, is you don't want to be paying back more than 8% of your income, and 8 to 10% in that range. And anything above that when you graduate is going to be causing you trouble. I think there are really two things that we know that we can say. One is graduate within those 4 years. I mean, that makes an enormous difference. So at least you are not adding on extra debt going year 5 and 6, and you're getting the return on your education. And 2, you just have to be really wary of debt as you can. And the basic answer is take on as little debt as you can to get that education as quickly as you can.
Much concern as we come to the end of the year about income inequality in America. 2 questions for you, gentlemen. Actually, I have a third one, but to start 2, number 1, why has the gap between the richest and the poorest widened so much in recent years? And 2, setting aside the morality of it, the ethics and all that, is this actually a problem for the economy? Chris.
Yes, so I think there's been, there's not one story when we're thinking about inequality and the growth of inequality in our country. So to a large extent, as we became aware about income inequality, which started to rise in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of it did seem to reflect what Lewis mentioned about these rewards through college education, technological change, technological upheaval, sort of where the jobs were. But then it continued way past that. And to a large extent, I think at this point, we're dealing with income inequality that is largely a political decision. You and I may not be exactly voting this way, but to a large extent, we do have these forces of globalization. We do have these forces of technological change. We do have the increasing demand for skilled labor, but that doesn't mean that income inequality has to be widening to the extent that it has been, and that largely reflects a political decision of what's going on. Do I worry about it? Enormously. I think that inequality is a shorthand term for capturing a lot of other things. It's about the worries about poor education in the inner cities or in parts of rural America. It's about that opportunities are being denied. I mean, it's a country where equality of opportunity is important. And if you go back and read de Tocqueville, he starts out with the importance of equality and defining the American experience. And so I think there is a growing sense that inequality has become, for many people, is becoming that you're tapped out and you do not have the advantages that other people do. And that does have a genuine economic impact, whether it's in terms of consumption or it's the quality of life, or even more importantly, sort of the civilization and the discourse within the society.
Lewis?
Yeah, the second question is the one that I think I want to focus in on. Is there a problem for the economy of having inequality? And I think there's this, I'll call it an urban legend, that in order for an economy to grow faster, you have to give incentives to people at the top. In a sense, you have to have these rewards go to the high-income earners, otherwise they won't work as hard or have as much innovation and everything. And what is really striking as an economic historian is that there just isn't any evidence in support of that. There just is no relationship between making sure that the top 10% or 1% get a lot of the rewards and the growth rate. And so I think there's kind of a fear, and that gets at your political point, Chris, about, I think people say, oh, well, I guess we got to accept this because otherwise it'll kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Well, no, it doesn't. It's just not that way. And for example, if we look across the pond over at countries in Europe, their growth rates, if you exclude the recent recession, and I think that's the way to do it, are just as good as the United States, and in some ways they're faster on certain dimensions, and yet they do much more redistribution using the tax and transfer system. There's a wonderful economist who some of my students are here, have heard his name too many times probably for their taste, but his name was Arthur Okun, and he wrote a wonderful book in the mid-70s called Equality and Efficiency, The Big Trade-Off. And he uses a metaphor of redistribution from higher income people to lower income people as a leaky bucket, that you're going to redistribute income from the upper income to the lower income, and that in the process there are leaks in the bucket. And the question is, how big are the leaks in the bucket versus the benefit to society from moving income from one group to another? And I think over the last 30 years, we've been convinced that the leaks are so big that it isn't worth having as big a transfers as we probably ought to. Okay, so and I would argue the other way around. I think the leaks aren't that big.
What's this with economics? You got the leaky bucket, you got trickle-down theory, you got a rising tide lifts all boats. I mean,
I got a pitcher of water in front of me.
You really like struggling poets here?
Yeah, well, stories matter. Stories matter, and that's one of the things that it's frustrating to me as an economist. I'm glad you brought this up. I'll take advantage of the opening here. That if you look out in the economics blogosphere and out in the writing, economists way too often resort to math. If in doubt, you resort to the math and you write down some equations saying, well, but the equations say this is true. And the best economics, I think, often flows from being able to tell a coherent, logical story in plain English. And if you can't do that, no amount of math is going to save you.
All right, let's scoot down the road about, 30, 40 years. The students currently at St. Ben's, St. John's, will they have a middle class to be part of, or will that have pretty much become, feast or famine? Either you're rich as can be or just struggling to get by.
I don't,
go ahead.
Yes, I think there will be. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless, and it's going to involve a significant amount of political argument. I think that we have a democracy, and this is another theme actually that Arthur Oken puts forth in his book that I mentioned, that one thing that's always equal in the United States is that there's one person, one vote. And if you can rally a coalition using those votes, you can get policy changed. And that's the scary thing about having campaign finance set up the way it is, because it changes that dynamic. But I think over time, yes, I think you're going to get political policies that at least ensure that the middle class doesn't disappear. Now, is it going to be as big as we necessarily want, or as much as I want, for example? That, I think, is going to be the fight.
Chris?
Okay, so just to put this in a little context, if you go back to 1979, the movie that defined what New York City, the future New York City, was Escape from New York, right? Manhattan was a maximum security prison. 1989 was the next movie that defined the future of New York City, which is New Jack City. And that was New York City, Manhattan was nothing but a crack house. Now, Manhattan's like one of the most expensive places in the world. It's like wonderful, it's beautiful, you wander around, it's completely safe. And so you have to be a little bit wary about these long-term forecasts. But since, Gary, you asked, I think that we're going to have a fundamental shift in the discussion in this country, and it's going to affect both the way that we talk about economic policy and also about social policy, and that the realization is going to be that we're going to move toward an economy and embrace something that we've not embraced since the 1970s, which is a full employment economy. And how do you achieve that? And we're going to move away from an economy that focuses mostly on the safety net, where the progressives or liberals focus on the safety net, and then your conservatives focus more on sort of regulatory and tax policy. And instead, there's going to be a much more debate about how does everyone have a job, and using the job as both your social safety net and also where you're going to get a lot of your middle class coming from. And part of this is going to be, in case you missed this, we have an aging population. You hear about this every day. The baby boomers are getting older. Well, the fact of the matter is a lot of baby boomers are going to want to continue to work. Well, what does that mean? How are we going to do that? You have a lot of young people today who aren't working. Now, half of that is because they're getting more education, they're getting more schooling, but half of that is because those job opportunities aren't there. How do we get those people working? So I think that we're going to move, our discussion is going to move more about full employment. How do you increase employment? How do you increase jobs? And in the end, that conversation is going to lead to reviving the middle class, helping out the middle class. And I think that colleges and universities are going to also be changed in this whole conversation, and it may become much less of a four-year college experience and much more of an experience that is over chunks of a lifetime, as opposed to one four-year period. But we're getting out, pretty far out there. So just think Escape from New York first.
Current conversation in part focuses on the minimum wage. Where should that be set? And rather than talk about numbers, let me ask you, gentlemen, this, because at the heart of that debate is the argument, if you raise the minimum wage, will you force employers to eliminate jobs? Thus, I get a higher wage, but you don't even get a job. Is that true or not, Chris Farrell?
So what is true, that if you raise the minimum wage, at least by a couple of dollars, you make it harder for the lower income person to get a job. It takes longer to get a job. It doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a job there. So it's not a zero-sum game, but it does mean that it takes longer to get a job, and therefore the question then becomes, okay, does that longer period of time, is it worth it because you're making a higher wage? An awful lot of this really, frankly, depends on what's happening with the overall economy. Is the economy growing? Is it not growing? Because if you look at the period 1948 to 1973, and that is the period of the growth of the middle class, and you look at that period of time, and we shared a lot, it was a high productivity economy, mass production, and the gains from productivity were shared throughout the economy. If we had the same sharing of productivity growth today that we had back then, the minimum wage without making any changes would be about $17 to $18 an hour. So that kind of gives you an idea.
It is currently 7 1/4.
Exactly.
Like that.
So You know, I think that there are a lot of reasons why there are better policies than the minimum wage. You know, the earned income tax credit. There's a lot of things you could do that would be better than the minimum wage. It's less of an imposition on small businesses and employers. But the fact is, anybody who is criticizing the minimum wage needs to say, I'm willing to take a stand on one of these other issues. There is a real problem here. The minimum wage is something people grasp. And so I think that it has a certain momentum behind it. I would argue that there are better policies, but there have to be better policies. The status quo is not acceptable.
Lewis?
Yeah, I pick up right on what you just said. I think that in a perfect world, the minimum wage isn't the way you would do it. And in fact, I'm really heartened lately, in the last certainly a couple of months, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a reopening of the idea that perhaps what the way to deal with this is a basic minimum income kind of policy, or what Milton Friedman called a negative income tax, or what George McGovern in the 1972 campaign called a demo grant, for a demographic grant, not a democratic grant. But the whole idea is, instead of having something that distorts the labor market, to use the term that economists use, like a minimum wage that could have these trade-offs, you basically put a floor under everybody's income and say, all right, we're going to make sure that either through the tax system or through a direct subsidy, everybody has a basic minimum income, and then the labor market does whatever the labor market does for people to earn their income. But I don't see that happening in the next 6 months or 2 years or anything, and so what do we have in reserve? Well, we have the minimum wage, and we have the earned income tax credit. And so clearly, it seems to me, we need to set the minimum wage, either raise it or index it to inflation or productivity or some combination of the two, so that it doesn't just stay in one spot. And secondly, fix the earned income tax credit. One of the things that I've noticed lately in some of the budget negotiations is people are kind of taking away some of that money because it's easy to make up some of the budget holes by not having the earned income tax credit be as big. Well, that's a terrible way to balance the budget. I'd rather have some explicit tax increases on people who could afford them than just eroding the earned income tax credit and kind of letting that happen with nobody know that it's going on.
All right, now it's your turn to question Lewis and Chris. So here's the thing. Stacy has a microphone. If you've got a question for the Council of Economic Advisors, raise your hand and Stacy will run over and get a microphone to you. It's important we use a mic so we can get your question on the radio tomorrow. So let's go. Let's get started right there.
This is a question about the cost of college. Chris, you've written about it, you participate in national forums. Lewis, you live it every day and within your family. The politics of the cost of college seems to me has changed sort of the nature of who goes to college. And at a place like St. John's and St. Ben's, with a high tuition, high aid policy and a modest endowment, the question is, do you think, given the public's perception of the cost of college, that we run the risk of creating a bifurcation in who attends college?
Lewis, you want to start?
Yes, I do. I'm quite concerned about that. One of the things that is really concerning about the cost of college and what people think of it as now is that the benefits of a college education accrue to the person who's getting it, and that's it. And so over the last certainly 20 years, and maybe even as far back as 30 or 35 years, the idea has been that state support, meaning government support, doesn't need to be as big because the premium that I mentioned earlier about going to college accrues to the individual, so they might as well borrow for it. And I think that's got to be part of the discussion we keep coming back to about the middle class is, do the benefits of a college education accrue to everyone? Do they accrue to the society as a whole as well as to the individual? I would argue they do, and so creating a model that subsidizes people to be able to go to college more generously, either directly through loans and grants or through giving money to institutions, is critical.
Chris?
I think that if you just look at the demographics and then you look at family incomes, the situation gets worse and worse for a lot of the colleges and universities without some sort of major reform along the way, whether it's how we do financial aid or how, less reliance on student loans or more money. But you have students that are going to come from family incomes that aren't that strong, not necessarily owning a home, not necessarily used to borrowing as much. And so I think that it does lead to a lot of financial strain on the colleges and universities. And that's why I take very seriously a lot of this talk about online learning and all that. You know, you look at those things and, you know, a lot of it you kind of go, okay, the technologists have condensed the future of 30 years out into the next 5 years, right? They're exaggerating what's going on. But nevertheless, these changes are coming because that gap between family income and where the demographics are going in college and the cost of college is just there. And you can just put a lot of this stuff driving right through it. You know that a number of governors are actually going to be reasonably serious about, you know, $10,000, right? I mean, they're going to make these statements. You get elected making that kind of a statement. So again, even if that's a foolish thing to be doing, that's part of this political environment that you're talking about. And so unless we do something more dramatic about sharing the cost of college, paying it back through the income tax system as opposed to the current system that we have right now, like Australia has done and Britain has embraced, until we do something like that, it's very difficult to see where the stress is not going to get worse.
Another question here. Sir?
Yeah, my question is related to income inequality, which is like one of the first topics you guys addressed. But before I ask my question, I want to tell a little story. When we students were like in elementary school, we always began the day reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and it ends equality and justice for all. And then when we get to our Econ 111 classes, we find out that some inequality is actually good for the economy, and like it fosters competition and stuff. And I mean, in our classes, we learn about like the Gini coefficient and how you want it like not too little, not too much, kind of.
Maybe you learned about that stuff. I went right over my head.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I was just wondering if you guys could comment on like Minnesota and maybe in general the United States, and like how much inequality is too much and how much is too little, and kind of compare that to like the American idea of like justice and equality for all and how that relates.
Chris, you want to start?
So I think this is one of those questions that we'll be arguing and debating, you know, for your lifetime and continuing. Peter Drucker is a great late professor of management, and he was a great writer and leading management consultant. And he's, you know, every CEO in the country loves to quote from Peter Drucker. They'll pull something from Peter Drucker, and he's very good. But the one thing they never quote from is that he argued consistently throughout his lifetime that the most efficient organization, the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid worker would be 25 times. Now, they never quote from this. Don't like this. If you go to, and you've probably seen the figures, you go to the post-World War II era, you know, the 1960s, the gap between the CEO and the typical factory worker, blue-collar worker, you know, somewhere around 100 times. Now it's up to around 600 times. And so in the U.S. context, the way that we have always dealt with this and had this conversation is, look, you do have rewards. We do know that doctors put in a lot of extra work, and they should get rewarded for that. Nurses put in a lot of extra work. They should get rewarded for that. CEOs with these multinational corporations, it's really complicated. You should get extra reward for that. But what is the, you know, what's the top? And what we've always focused on is, okay, this middle class issue that came on. How do you bring up more people along who believe that they at least are, that it is a rising tide lifts all boats? And what has happened and why the debate has gotten so difficult is that we have a rising tide is lifting the yachts. And that's a large part of this the discussion that's going on right now, and it feeds into inequality, it feeds into, you know, how you think about it. But in the U.S. context, I think in considering U.S. history and considering our immigrant heritage, that we'll always be talking about it in terms of the middle class and the working class and participating more in the fruits of the economy and the fruits of the gain. And we'll talk, and it becomes less and less an important issue about how wealthy are the wealthy, except for the period of time like we're in right now.
Lewis?
Yeah, I don't think there's a number that you could put on it. And I don't think you were asking for one, but I don't think there is. But I find it really interesting. There's been surveys done where people are asked, what would be the ideal income distribution? What do you think that it looks like today? And then what is it actually? And what people perceive the income distribution today in the United States to be is Scandinavia. They don't even realize quite how bad it even is. So part of what I think has to go on to get the discussion going is people have to understand even what the data are. They don't understand that, for example, my wife and I, our household income puts us in the 84th percentile. And every once in a while I look around the house and I go, I'm in the 84th percentile? Holy cow. I mean, this is, and my neighbors aren't, and yet they're probably in the 70-something. Well, wait a second, what are the people in the 90th? What are the people in the 99th? People don't even understand that data, and so one thing that I think is a responsibility for people like me is to make sure you at least understand those numbers, and then what you do with them, that's part of what being a democratic society is all about. By the way, I think it's liberty and justice for all, isn't it? But just making sure. I do teach American economic history. I better have this right. I didn't think it was.
But just to throw in a complication, if you compare our world to, say, like the Gilded Age or the latter part of the 19th century, and so there in the latest Vanity Fair or the issue before, there's a really wonderful interview with Ives, the great designer at Apple. And the reporter comes in. Now, Ives is obviously extremely wealthy. It's this beautiful home. The reporter comes in to interview him, and they both have the exact same iPhone. And so there are aspects of our life where there is a certain type of equality in terms of certain types of communications and expectations, and which was not really true in the latter part of the 19th century. I mean, they truly lived vastly different lives. And if there was an iPhone back then, one would have worked and one wouldn't have. So part of the complication about this whole discussion about inequality is that in certain ways, life has become more equal. And the status competition's gotten weird, but the fact is it's not that important if you really take a step back. In other ways, in terms of income and going to college and certain types of health opportunities and health outcomes, this inequality still remains incredibly important.
It strikes me that that's where the rubber hits the road in all this as well, because, for example, 100 years ago, James J. Hill died of an infection. And everybody died of an infection because there was no penicillin and the drugs that you would take now to do it. And now I think part of the income inequality problem that people identify it is they say, look, they have access to things I don't like, some kind of medical treatment, and I don't. They perceive this as fundamentally unfair or wrong, and that's where it actually shows up. It isn't so much in the income numbers, it's what can you buy with that income, or what do you get as being part of American society.
Again, if you have a question, just raise your hand and Stacy will get to you. Meanwhile, gentlemen, off we go to Washington. Is there too much or not enough focus on deficits and debt? Lewis.
Okay. Lewis. Okay. There's too much focus on the short-term deficit and debt and not enough on the long-term. My favorite number over the last couple of years is one that I don't know if any of you have heard. It's $211 trillion. It's the difference between what we have committed to spend basically over the future 75, 100 years versus what we have committed to take in taxes. $211 trillion. Now, nobody talks about that. They talk about this year's deficit, they talk about this year's debt, but that's the number that we're all going to have to live with, because that's either going to have to get closed by increased taxes or cuts in spending. There's no bookkeeping way to deal with that problem.
What about economic growth? We hear that as a magic elixir.
The problem there is that a lot of the things that are in that number, like Social Security and other kinds of benefits, are tied to the rate of growth. And so it doesn't get you out of that problem. So there's really no other way out of that. And I find a lot of what's going on in Washington, to be blunt, just a sideshow, and a way to avoid talking about the real issue. It's like, oh, look over there. Just, no, that's not the right, it's not the right discussion.
Chris?
So, if I were dictator, if I were czar in Washington, D.C., look, let's just look over the next 5 years, and let's do some things that you can really make a difference with. All right, I know these long-term projections, but immigration reform, this is a major issue, and this needs to be dealt with. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and this is just with the 401k, and we've had 3 decades of experience with the main retirement savings plan in the U.S., and we basically now know how to really improve it. So you look at these projections about Gen Xers, and you look at the long-term projections right now, about 20-year projections with Gen Xers, it doesn't look good with the 401k plan, but you got 20 years. You could pass a series of laws, which really are not that intrusive at all, that really turn the 401k into a really good plan. Is there anyone talking about this? No, we want to talk about aging people, and we want to talk about how we don't have the money and we can't afford this. Well, okay, let's deal with the real problem here. The long-term projections, yeah, they're worrisome, but the fact is, let's take a couple of steps To get there, let's talk less about the debt and the deficit. Deficit's going to take care of itself, which means also the deficit the debt will also shrink over time. And let's deal with some things that actually have a real economic impact, like immigration.
Yes, sir. Your question, please.
Yes, there's a little broader view. Traditional economic wisdom held that as employment decreased in one sector like agriculture, some other thing would increase like industrialization, or after that service industry and information technology. But it seems that with globalization, things have really changed, that there's just simply a surfeit of labor. Europe has much higher unemployment rates than we do, and the developing world has much higher. Are we moving into a time when we should be expecting higher unemployment rates globally, even in face of an economic recovery?
Chris?
So I put it slightly differently. I mean, because what I agree with you is that I think over the next 20 years that employment is the issue. And that's what we're really going to be talking about. And how do you have greater employment in an economy where there's a lot of globalization? But if you take that sort of traditional economic model, or use traditional economic models, and I said that between 1980 and 2000, I think that's the numbers, that the global labor supply would increase 4 times. And that basically the U.S. unemployment rate, except for the period during the Great Recession, but the U.S. unemployment hasn't been that bad. And you would sort of say, well, that's impossible. And so I think that a lot of this is the pie gets bigger, and as the pie gets bigger, there's going to be a lot of jobs, and we can absorb a lot of jobs. And really the bigger question is, how do you distribute the gains, the wealth in our economy? And the way we traditionally distribute wealth in our society and the major industrial nations is through the job market. That's the major way that we've always distributed the wealth. So one of the big questions is, leading with the job market is, I think there's a lot of reasons where you can forecast where jobs are going to come as we have lots of robots doing lots of things. But the real question is, how do you expropriate the wealth that's being created by the robots to get it to people who are doing jobs that we really value but are low-wage jobs at this point in time? That doesn't mean they have to be low-wage jobs. I'm thinking of things like caregiving, which is a growing field. Caregiving is a low-wage job. Well, if the robot is incredibly productive in creating all this wealth, why not take some of the wealth from the robot and transfer it over to the caregiver where there is job growth? So I think job growth I'm reasonably optimistic about. The question is, will these jobs pay well? And how do you accomplish that? Because there are good ways to accomplish it and there are bad ways.
Lewis?
Well, I agree with everything you said, and I would just add one other thing to it, which is part of what I think we're seeing is that we're making the transition from an more industrial economy to a more service economy, and that industrial economy tended to have people who would work in the same company or in the same field over the course of their life. So it was okay to have things like a pension plan located in a company that you would get when you retired, or your health care through a company. I think those things are making that transition, what I'd call, to use the economics jargon, sectoral redistribution from, say, manufacturing to services or something. That's making that more difficult because people say, well, geez, if I do that, I'll lose my health care. I can't possibly leave this job, or I can't start my own business. I won't have any retirement. I'll lose my 401k if it's a business-based one, or my traditional pension if I'm lucky enough to still have one of those. And that's got to be part of this whole discussion of how much of what we do as a society should be just social insurance, not tied to your job. Healthcare, why should that be through the job? That's just a World War II accident that it's set up that way. We need to have that discussion. Otherwise, we will get stuck, I think, with people staying in sectors or staying unemployed looking for jobs in particular sectors because they know there's health care there, whereas there's not in others. We got to do something to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Talking about health care, is Obamacare a threat to the U.S. economy? Lewis?
No. You want me to elaborate? No, it's not. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, well, since you got to be dictator or king or whatever, if I was king, I would not have set it up this way. But given,
I'm just a radio announcer.
Well, you know, we can all pretend. That's the beauty of life. I would have not gone with this, but given that this is the policy that we've gone forward with, I actually think it will, in some ways, benefit the economy, because one of the things that I think is inevitable over the next 25 to 30 years is that the share of healthcare healthcare spending as a share of GDP is going to keep growing. There's just no way around that. So the question is, how do we make that work to the benefit of most people? And one way we can do that is to make sure that people have access to it, and the other way is to make sure that people are trained to work in that sector. So if you think of it from both of those ways, those are both positive outcomes of Obamacare.
Well, I do think that a lot of people should have been fired in terms of how this rollout has gone. I think a year from now, a lot of it's going to fade away. But this is really a bad way to get to where we're going. And where we're going is we're moving away from, as Louis was mentioning, where most people get their health insurance through their employer. And we're moving toward a system where the individual buys it. And if you look at most economists, whether they're liberal, mainstream, conservative, universally they'll agree that this employer-based system is a bad system, and it should be tied to the individual. Now, some of the Washington, D.C. think tanks might not go along with that. You might have to lubricate the discussion with a couple of scotches and cigars, but basically they are going to agree, and that's where we're moving toward, but it's a very ugly move in that direction, and it needn't be this bad.
And the question is how to tie it to the individual, too. That's the big question. Should we have a single-payer system? We basically have Medicare for all, or do you have a voucher system where people just get a grant and then go out and buy insurance? You could do either one of those. And my argument would be either one of those would be better than what we did. But the political machinery got so, the gears ground together so badly that we ended up just taking what we had and making improvements to that.
Your question, please.
Ben Bernanke held his last official press conference yesterday. Your assessment of his tenure?
Did he save the nation from depression? I guess the long and the short of it. Louis? We should know, you wrote a book with Ben Bernanke.
Well, I've never met him. I've written the chapters for his book and never got to meet the man or talk to him. That's on purpose because of the government regulations. But trying to be objective, I actually think he was the right man at the right time. You needed somebody in 2007, 2008 who understood financial crises in general and understood the history of financial crises in particular. And he understood that. He understood both the theoretical and the historical background. Now, did he do everything right? Of course not. Nobody does. But if I think of who the alternatives were, I'm very glad when I think about some of the other people that President Bush might have appointed in February of 2006, especially since they've been quite vocal about what they would have done instead. They would have let more banks go under. They would not have driven interest rates down to zero. They've objected to quantitative easing. And my view is if those people would have been head of the Federal Reserve, we would have been way worse off.
Chris?
Yeah, so I would agree. I mean, the main criticism comes before, in the period of time before, and there was a lot of asleep at the wheel. And then another criticism that is, I think, going to grow over time is how the bailout was dealt with, and that there was simply not enough of a quid pro quo with the banks. It was more of a blank check. And these are all decisions that are made under the gun where the consequences of making a wrong decision are enormous. But this is where we're going to be looking back again and trying to understand. There's a general agreement that this period of time, 2008, 2009, early 2010, when it looked like we were entering into a deflationary debt spiral, which is when prices are falling, which makes debt more expensive, which leads to more layoffs, that was his moment. That was the moment of the Fed, where they really did take the actions that needed to be taken. Since then, it becomes a more controversial legacy. My own feeling is this quantitative easing, the notion about the zero bound, which is when interest rates hit zero, that this is actually what the Fed is going to have to deal with in the future. Because back in 2000, 2001, that downturn, we flirted with deflation in 2003. This downturn, we've flirted with deflation twice. And now that you have central bankers around the world are worrying about low inflation, something that they have been calling for, crying for the past 3 decades. And now they're sort of realizing that low inflation is great as long as it's not too low. And so I think that what Bernanke will be looked back on is that he did a lot of seat-of-the-pants experimentation of what is going to become routinized by the Federal Reserve over time, learning from this experience. So he will go down in history as a public servant that actually rose to the occasion.
Janet Yellen takes over at January 31st. Good choice, bad choice. Chris?
Good choice. I mean, excellent choice. A wonderful economist. She's had a lot of experience in and out of Washington, which is absolutely valuable in terms of that. So no, I think it's an absolutely great choice. And I also think that in the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve, that a woman is now head of the Fed is a real step.
Lewis?
It's an excellent choice. Where the president has fallen down on is that there are going to be 3 more potentially open seats within the next few months, and he hasn't moved to nominate anybody for them. And I can't imagine allowing the Supreme Court to have 5 justices on it, and it's just as bad to have the Federal Reserve with only 3 or 4 governors out of 7.
Question, sir?
An underlying theme of the discussion has been the relationship between economics and the kind of the ethics of economics. You know, what's the effect in society? And Pope Francis has jumped in by condemning trickle-down economics, and he suggested it's bad economics, but he also, of course, said it's bad ethics. Would you like to comment on his thoughts?
Lewis?
Well, far be it for me to take on the Pope, but especially here, and I don't intend to, but I thought it was quite interesting what he was talking about, because he used that phrase, but then when you read the document, which the name escapes me right now, but he's actually calling for an economics that looks a lot more like what it is in the textbooks, I think, which is where people's earnings reflect what they actually do in the market rather than, say, extracting wealth from others. And so even though he used that term, and even though it's kind of gotten painted as he's against standard economics, I think what he's got in there reflects the idea of markets that are operating within an ethical framework, which is something I actually would support.
Chris?
And you also have to remember that, Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, and Francis basically have said the exact same thing. I mean, if you look at their writings, it has upset certain people that they write this way. It's essentially about society being inclusive. I mean, if you think about it, it's really about, and it's an old-fashioned conservative notion that everybody should be engaged. And there's a wonderful economist, Ned Phelps, at Columbia University, and he's been working on this project for the past 20 years. He's famous for a lot of his anti-inflation stuff, but he's working on a project past 20 years is how does everybody have a job? How does everybody feel that they're part of our society? Lots of institutions in our society are changing. The job is one of the major ones that you can attach people to, and they feel that they are part of, that they have a purpose, that they have a reason for being here. And if you actually look at what the past 3 popes have been talking about when they discuss economics, they're not disagreeing with income inequality. They're not disagreeing about incentives. They're not disagreeing about the advantages of capitalism, recognize the enormous advantages of capitalism, but they're talking about a more inclusive ideology. And whether Pope Francis is liberal or not, he's a Jesuit, which is why he's talking inclusive. But as a Jesuit, he also doesn't mind that there are some people that do better than others.
Hindsight is always 20/20, or at least that's what we're told. In hindsight, was the bailout of General Motors a good idea? Presumably, the government has gotten almost all of its money back. It's no longer in the car business. Was that a good idea, Chris?
Yes, it was. It was a good idea. That was it could have been done better, but Steve Ratner, who was in charge of it, actually did a brilliant job in that situation. Manufacturing, it would have been a disaster if General Motors had gone under at that point in time. We have to remember what the environment is like, and I think that it's also extremely important with some major institutions that made a statement that the system is not just the banks. And whenever you have bailouts, you have to hold your nose. Bailouts are unfair, they are ugly, it needed to be done. If you had sacrificed the workers at that period of time, not only would it have been economically damaging, but I think it would have been extremely damaging to whatever confidence we had in the economy at that time.
Lewis?
Yeah, I think it was a good idea, and the people do talk about whether the government got their money back or stuff. That isn't, I don't think, the way to measure it. The way to measure it is, this disruption. Would we have, in a sense, let the economy have a heart attack and not do anything about it? in the late part of 2008 and the early part of 2009 by letting them go bankrupt? Yes, it would have been a massive disruption, and whether you think it would have been good in the long run or not, you got to get through the short run, and I think it would have driven another stake through the heart of the U.S. economy at the time.
Now, I am all in favor, by the way, of having on the shelf essentially prepackaged bankruptcies in this situation where you wipe out the equity holders and you wipe out the option holders. And I see no reason why management should at all, or any equity holder in this type of company. And you can do this, it's called prepackaged bankruptcy. And that's a better route to go. Oh, yeah. Under the circumstance, that's why I say, but under the circumstances they were in, I don't think that was a viable option. I think going forward, if we're going to face this again, boy, we better have thought it through, and prepackaged bankruptcy is the way to go.
You can't simply say, we're never going to do this again. Well, of course we're going to do it again. Question is, how are we going to do it, and let's do it right.
Okay, a couple more questions, and we have to wrap up. Too big to fail, is that still lurking out there as a problem? Lewis?
Yes, it's terrible, and going back to what I said about the Federal Reserve Board, I would urge President Obama to put Gary Stern, the former president of the Minneapolis Fed, on the Federal Reserve Board as a governor, because he's the leading expert on that problem.
Chris?
Well, it is, and it's not a problem right now. I mean, look, too big to fail is dead for the next couple of years. But the question is, what happens 10 years ago? So a while back was in New York, and you're standing in that corner of Broad and Wall Street, and there, you have the First Federal Building, and you have the New York Stock Exchange. And those two are still there, and it's remarkable. But I remember when I went to work in New York, and it was Drexel Burnham Lambert and Salomon Brothers, and they were the two dynamic firms, one in junk bonds, one in mortgage-backed securities. Well, unless you lived through the area, who remembers what Drexel Burnham Lambert was? I think it's Deutsche Bank is now in their building, and Salomon Brothers is a shadow itself, but it's the Goldman Sachs building. And this is, it is the drive. I mean, look, Wall Street, CEOs love giving this talk. Leaders love giving this talk. We love change. We love change. Nobody likes change. Nobody really wants change. But in Wall Street, these are people who actually really do thrive on change and believe on change. And what is striking is that in the 1960s, Goldman Sachs opened a bank, a little tiny bank in London, just on the off chance that Glass-Steagall might disappear over the next 30 years. So my suspicion is at this point in time, no, the regulators have been too burned, the bank leadership has been too burned, too many people are watching. But in 10 years' time, we're going to be growing fast. And you're going to hear this statement, if you just loosen the rules a little bit, we can lend more to mom and pop, we can lend to these small businesses. I don't want to lend to small business, but we're going to lend to small business, and we'll be back to, we're kind of a scary situation. So we still have an opportunity to make things better, because that drive is there. It's not evil. It is not bad. It is in the nature of the beast.
Let us move forward to December of next year, 2014. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, currently at about 16,000, will be, Chris?
18,000.
Lewis?
I have no idea.
The unemployment rate right now, national, plus or minus, what, 7%? At this time next year, Lewis?
6.5.
Chris?
6.3.
All right. The American dream still alive? Can people actually get ahead in America if they work hard? Chris?
Yes.
Lewis?
No.
Yes. But working hard is not all you need. You also need education, and you need the breaks.
Aren't these guys good? Lewis Johnston and Chris Farrell. Thanks again for coming over. Really appreciate it. It's always fun. Always fun.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.